throughout this event. Looking forward to hearing more. Michael McKee, of course, our Bloomberg News TV and radio international economics and policy correspondent there in D.C. Hey, we want to go back to what is, no doubt about it, for a second day, our top story, and that has to do with the tariffs, the Supreme Court decision that we got on Friday. Now, as you know, the Trump administration swiftly announced plans to replace the prior tariffs with a new across-the-board 15% levy on on U.S. imports. Well, that creates kind of temporary winners. We are still trying to find our way. And we just heard from Mike talking about that when it comes to economists and even Fed officials waiting to kind of figure out what this all means. So let's see, though, exactly where we are, what we are continuing to hear from the White House. We head to the Bloomberg News, Washington, D.C. Bureau, and to our Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst, Nathan Dean. Hey, Nathan, come on in. Tell us kind of where we are, what has truly changed when it comes to presidential tariffs. Where are we?
Yeah, so President Trump signed an executive order putting 15% tariffs under Section 122 of the Trade Act. Now, these tariffs are global in nature, but they can only last for 150 days. And there's a lot of questions about the legality of these tariffs and also whether or not Congress will appropriate them or authorize them back in 150 days. And we at Bloomberg Intelligence actually think that the real question here is, when is the White House going to transfer from a 122 tariff to what is known as a Section 301 tariff? Now, we think that's going to come within the first 150 days, so we don't think this congressional authorization is all that important. But under Section 301, it requires an investigation. And there are already investigations in place for places like China, certain aspects of Europe, and also Brazil. And then under Section 301, the president does have the authority to go as high as he wants for an extended amount of time. It's actually for about 4 years. And so the real question for us is, what are these investigations going to show? Because sometime in probably the next 5 months, another round of tariff announcements are going to be made. The biggest question, though, is that if the president decides to move forward with these Section 301 tariffs, it's going to come months right before the midterm elections. Is that something the White House wants to do to an American populace that isn't all that popular, or finding tariffs all that popular? Still TBD on that one.
So, Nathan, when you think about the news that we did get about the Supreme Court decision on Friday, where do we stand now with just how much authority the president has legally to impose new tariffs? Has that authority been scaled back, even now that we see that there are, again, new 15% tariffs?
So it was scaled back under IEEPA, which is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, but it hasn't in other areas. And so Congress largely delegated tariffs away from its authority about 50 years ago and really hasn't taken any steps to claw that back. So when President Trump says on Truth Social that Congress has given him the power, he's largely correct when it comes to things like Section 301 and Section 232. Now, this is where I think President Trump and the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer are going to fall back on, is that, look, they were using IEEPA to implement these tariffs on a global nature, but now instead of being able to say, look, I'm going to put in a Truth Social announcement saying how's a new tariff on this country, they have to go back and actually do an investigation. There's a notice and comment period. So while it doesn't provide much clarity for the markets, it at least gives us an idea of what the White House is targeting. So there's a little bit of clarity for the markets, but higher tariffs are still most likely in store.
And Nathan, still in store is the president out on his social media company. And let me just go there, because he did, just after the market opened this morning in New York, President Trump out on social saying any country that wants to play games with the ridiculous Supreme Court decision, especially those that have ripped off the USA for years and even decades, will be met with a much higher tariff, and worse than that, which they just recently agreed to, buyer beware. So once again, we're back to kind of social media. We're back to, it feels like threats. It feels like, a reminder of what many say is a transactional president. So like, if you don't play ball, there's going to be worse stuff coming. So has a lot changed or not?
So just to play into that scenario, there's really two things that President Trump's thinking about after reading the Bloomberg News reporting that my guess is that he was referring to the European Union news, that they were halting negotiations. There's really two ways President Trump can respond to that. He can't use IEEPA anymore, but there is an investigation into Europe already under Section 301. So maybe 30 days from now, 60 days from now, we just don't unfortunately know. President Trump could just say, okay, under Section 301, here's the increased tariff for the European Union. And that can last for 4 years, and it can go as high as he wants. The other thing that President Trump can do is actually investigate this idea of licensing, because even though President Trump doesn't have the authority under IEEPA to say here's what the new tariff is, he does have the authority to say, you know what, you want to sell cars in the United States? You're limited at 100,000 or 200,000 or a million. And so that's another avenue that, when President Trump talks about licensing, that's specifically what he's referring to. So long story short, or the short story long is that President Trump still has a lot of authority here, and the clarity, it's a little bit better, but not all that great for markets still at the moment.
When you think about their plan, is the White House at all confused about what it's going to do next? Or it seems like you said, they have a lot of options here.
It's really a mixed message coming from the White House, because tomorrow night in the State of the Union, you're going to hear President Trump double down on tariffs, and he's going to continue to say tariffs is my favorite word in the in the English language. But on the same side, he's also going to be talking about affordability, and he's going to be trying to talk about prices, food prices, consumer goods, et cetera, trying to drive prices down. And it's almost sort of like a mixed message here. So, it's something that the White House will probably have to figure out, because, his approval rating isn't all that great. I mean, we're talking about some of the highest disapproval ratings in his presidency, and we're only months away until the campaign season. So I think that's a message the White House is grappling with, and it's something they're going to have to address.
Yeah, and I feel like members of Congress, GOP members in particular, right, they are thinking about the midterms in a big way too. And I thought it was really smart how you laid out the 301 tariffs and the investigations, and how the clock ticks down to the midterms. I mean, they've got to be thinking about what the strategy is as midterms get closer, and where they want to be in terms of the U.S. economy and the perception when it comes to things like affordability.
Yeah, I would keep an eye on the primary calendar. Primary season starts in March, and, generally the rule of thumb is you play to the party for the primary, and then you play to the independents when you go into the general election. And so for a lot of the Republican members right now, they just don't want to upset the party, and they don't want to upset President Trump, because as we saw just with Representative Hurd from Colorado, President Trump pulled his endorsement based off of how he voted on tariffs prior to the primary. So after the primary season, which is March, April, and May, after that, you would probably see Republicans move more towards the center and being a little bit more, at least airing uneasiness of this tariff policy, not to the point where they're going to oppose the president. But again, that's where I think the public-facing Republican mantra is versus what they're thinking in private. There's a lot of uneasiness about tariffs in the United States right now, and they still have to figure it out before the midterms.
Hey, just quickly, and in the next hour, we're going to talk about the legality of all of this and what happens in terms of the refunds. Anything you're hearing on that front when it comes to what the White House is expecting, or what measures they might do to counter that, or can they at this point? Real quickly.
So, honestly, I think if you're a litigation lawyer and trade refunds, you're going to have a very busy 3 years ahead of yourself, because, this is where I think this is most likely going, is you're going to have to sue the U.S. government to get your refunds back, and it's going to have to play through the courts.
All right, great stuff. As always, Nathan Dean, thank you so much. He's Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst. Nathan Dean there at the D.C. Bureau for Bloomberg News.